Hello, welcome to Creative Writing Corner. I am Luke J. Morris, your host and hopefully instructor and guide in this channel. And today, I'm very tired. I just finished my grades and I'm going into our last week of school. You guys know I'm an English and creative writing teacher and I love the job, absolutely love it, which is really the only thing keeping me there. But I'm very, very ready for the break that summer will give me. It will give me some time to focus on my own writing and focus on some things that I want to do. Hopefully building this YouTube channel. I'm planning to do that as well. So this is really to celebrate 100 subscribers. And I appreciate all of you guys for subscribing. 100 it seems like a small milestone, but it's a huge milestone for me. It's a great first step, and I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you spread the word to other would-be writers who could use a little help or a little inspiration on making their craft better, learning new things, new techniques, new ideas about their craft, about either the craft of using language to communicate better or just the craft of storytelling in general. So today, as a celebration of 100 subscribers, I went back and forth about what to do with this one, and I decided, well, I might as well talk about my 10 biggest writing influences. And I had to think about this, but it didn't take too long. They were all pretty much near the top of my head. Mainly, and there are a lot of writing influences, to be fair. I have been influenced by just about everything I've ever read, and I've read thousands of things. I am a voracious reader. So today I am going to focus primarily on my fiction writing influences, because fiction writing is really my passion. It's what I put most of my energy and time into, the art and craft of fiction writing and understanding fiction and how to tell stories and how to make stories better. So we're going to just dive right in. And I'm going to start with the obvious one. Since I am an English teacher and I am a writer, it might figure that I was highly inspired by William Shakespeare. The classics, of course, the nerdy ones. I'm not putting this out there to be pretentious. I love Shakespeare. Ask any one of my students who's ever come through my classes, because it's my goal for my students, when they come to my classes to learn Shakespeare, that they grow to love Shakespeare too. Not everyone does, but just about every student who comes through my class leaves with a bigger and better understanding of Shakespeare and a better appreciation for Shakespeare. They can at least understand how Shakespeare can be enjoyed. And that is one of my major goals, is to get people to enjoy Shakespeare. Now, how did he influence me? Well, just his use of language and the way that he can take classic stories, because he didn't make up most of the stories that he wrote into his plays, and turn them into compelling, real characters, even speaking in highfalutin, rhyming iambic pentameter. These characters feel real. They feel like real people you could meet, even as stylized as it can get. Shakespeare has something to communicate to every generation of storyteller. If you haven't read Shakespeare, if you've never been taught to read Shakespeare, taught by someone who loves it, not just somebody who is an English geek and has learned the fundamentals of Shakespeare and talks about iambic pentameter and stuff like that, but somebody who shows you why Shakespeare is great, who shows you how you can understand Shakespeare at a deeper level. If you want to know how big a Shakespeare fan I am, this is something my mom gave me for Christmas. A book of Shakespeare insults. Mom knows me very well. I do desire that we may be better strangers. Scratching could not make it worse, and 'twere such a face as yours. Thou crusty batch of nature, what news? Anyway, you bottle ale rascal, you basket-hilt stale juggler, you. Asses are made to bear, and so are you. A whoreson, beetle-headed, flap-eared knave. The devil damn thee black, thou cream-faced loon. You can can write insults like that, and those aren't even, in my opinion, Shakespeare's best ones. Insults like that, double entendres, the way he can put in bawdy and salacious information, dirty jokes, everything in such a clever and interesting way that you have to think about it, and thinking about it makes it 10 times more amusing or hard-hitting or impactful when you read it. That's just something that should inspire every writer to up their game. So going on from Shakespeare, another one of the classics here, another one that you'll get from a lot of English teacher types, but is still very accessible for the modern reader and just beyond incredible. Fyodor Dostoevsky. I have not read everything by Dostoevsky, and that's to my shame. This one's been sitting on my couch here, The Idiot, and or on my shelf, I should say, and I will read this as soon as I get the chance. But right now, this is my second reading of the Brothers Karamazov, which is widely known as the greatest novel ever written. And I'm about this much of the way through with it. This is my first reading of this translation. This is a relatively new translation. The previous translation, I was 2/3 of the way through when I realized that even though it was 700 pages long, it was an abridgment. So that was disappointing. It was still very, very good, but not as good as Crime and Punishment, which I read in full, or Notes from Underground, which I have read and taught numerous times. It's just one of my all-time favorite philosophical novellas. But this is such a phenomenal novel. Everything Dostoevsky writes, even though it is realism, which is not always my favorite genre of choice, it's strict Russian naturalism is what it is, still, it's so fluid in the language, it's so readable, and the characters are so alive. You will never meet characters in literature quite like the characters in Brothers Karamazov. You'll never meet characters who, you know when they say characters walk off the page? Brothers Karamazov, right here. I just realized I forgot an author. So I'm going to change this to the top 11 writers who influenced me, because I can't just limit it to 10. I'd forgotten all about, for some reason, even though it was at the top of the mind when I was first thinking about this list, Mark Twain. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, even Tom Sawyer or Life on the Mississippi. Mark Twain, from his style to the depth of his storytelling and, again, realism of his characters, is a great inspiration for me. His sardonic wit, the way he mocks just about everybody in government, which is wonderful, the way he mocks racism and bigotry, and does it in such a brilliant way that you have no comeback. That has influenced me. If you ever read any writing of mine and you see the traces of irony, I load up my writing with irony. It's part of my nature. It's part of my authorial voice. And a lot of that comes from Mark Twain. Coming much more contemporary, I cannot deny that Stephen King has been a huge influence on me. He is one of the best-selling authors of all time. Certainly one of the most successful authors currently living. And I have been a fan of King since I was in high school, when I used to, during study hall, we were allowed to go into the library instead of study hall, so I'd check into the library and I'd just sit there and read books all day. And I'd read H.P. Lovecraft, I'd read J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'd read Stephen King. I read The Dark Tower, I read at least the first couple of books that were published at that point. I read The Stand, I read The Shining, I read Salem's Lot, I read The Dark Half, I read roughly half of what Stephen King had published at the time. And I've read a number of other novels since then. I have not read his entire work of fiction, all of his body of collected works, by any stretch of the imagination. And honestly, some of his books I like a lot better than others. Some of them, particularly some of his endings, I think, are not that great. But the way he tells a story with this propulsive, gripping narrative that really just pulls you into the story, and he writes page turners. You can't put it down. You just have to go page after page after page just devouring the story. That has always been an inspiration of mine. It's something that I do try to do in most of my fiction writing, with greater or lesser success, depending. But still, Stephen King, I can't deny the influence. If you read him, you'll be influenced too. Another contemporary author, one of my favorite currently living authors, and I've seen him speak, and he's signed a couple of books for me. And I've taught this book, actually, in my English class a couple of times. This is Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere. But Neil Gaiman, I started off reading Sandman comics. I read a few of those back in the 90s. Didn't really start devouring the entire series until they were on graphic novel, when they were in early 2000s. And that's about the same time I read this, which is his first novel from 1997. And then I read Stardust and American Gods. And since then, I've read just about every single thing he's published. I even bought his masterclass on masterclass.com. It's the only masterclass I've ever paid for, but just because I love to hear Neil Gaiman talk about writing, and his masterclass is incredibly inspirational. So I do recommend it if you are a writer who loves to think new ways of writing fiction, new ideas about that. Check out Neil Gaiman, but definitely read his work. It's absolutely worth your while. Now we're going to get into more poppy stuff, more popular authors that might not fit the literary oeuvre as much as the previous ones did. Some people say that about Stephen King, but Stephen King has become much more literary in recent years. And Neil Gaiman is always literary, and of course Dostoevsky and Shakespeare are two of the canon of Western literature. But Heinlein, Robert Heinlein, is not part of the canon of Western literature, but he is the granddaddy of science fiction, as they say. He didn't invent the genre. It goes back to H.G. Wells and Jules Verne in the late 1800s. He started writing in the 1920s and 30s after he retired from the Navy. And he's kind of a weird dude, just to warn you. He's got some weird ideas and some interesting stuff, but my God, Robert Heinlein, I've read at least 20 books by him, and that's barely scratching the surface of everything he wrote. But from Stranger in a Strange Land to The Moon is a Harsh Mistress to Starship Troopers, Heinlein, his exploration of ideas, his characters are never deep, but his dialogue is very fun. It's quippy. It's very sharp. I enjoy that sharp dialogue. He's got a kind of a Hemingway edge to him. And Hemingway is one of those that I did not put on this list, but he definitely gets a footnote for me, because even though he's not one of my favorite authors to reread over and over again, in terms of literary authors, I've read a lot of his stuff and I really do enjoy it, and he has influenced my style quite a bit. But in terms of storytelling, Heinlein has influenced it more, because his exploration of different ideas and his willingness to go outside the bounds of normalcy. He's got weird countercultural views on sex and relationships and government and all sorts of things, and he has no fear of exploring those issues through fictional stories. What's going to happen in the future? He is speculative fiction, because he shows us how to use fiction to speculate. Many people might pick Asimov as their favorite sci-fi author, or Frank Herbert of Dune as their favorite sci-fi author, and I don't knock those guys at all. But for me, if I'm just going to pick up a sci-fi book and read it from cover to cover, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be Heinlein. I cannot deny I love pulp fiction. I mentioned H.P. Lovecraft earlier on, and he's influenced me to a certain extent, certainly in a lot of my ideas. In my horror writing, I have pulled in Lovecraftian ideas, and Robert E. Howard, author of Conan the Barbarian, Conan the Cimmerian, he's definitely a huge influence on me in terms of writing fantasy stuff from a kind of a darker, harsher edge than Tolkien or C.S. Lewis might be. But one of my favorite genres outside of the fantasy horror realm, which is where I spend a lot of my time, is the noir mystery. If you've ever read Dashiell Hammett, The Maltese Falcon, or The Thin Man, you've ever read, oh boy, I am drawing a blank on all the other great detective novels, which I've read tons of. But Mickey Splaine. Mickey Splaine, Raymond Chandler was the other one I was thinking of. Mickey Splaine, though, is one of the huge influences. He's now often mentioned in the canon of detective novels, even though he is one of the best-selling novelists of the 20th century. And he still sells plenty of copies today. He is so eminently readable. His style is so blunt and direct, but still imagistic. He paints perfect pictures with an economy of words. Not in a Hemingway literary type of sense, not quite that economy, but an economy that drives the narrative forward. We are pulled into the narrative, and every story, it always starts with Mike Hammer, the detective, has some personal loss. It's not a detective trying to solve a mystery. It's a detective driven to solve the murder of his friend. It's a detective driven to figure out who kidnapped his secretary and lover. There's personal stakes that amp things up so high, and I really drew a lot from that. Raising the stakes and driving tension and suspense with weird twists at the end. With twist endings that are set up well, but still never given away. If you want to write good, hard-boiled mystery, even if you want to do it in an urban fantasy setting, if you like the Dresden Files, let's say, you got to go back to Mickey Spillane and get the roots of that style. And I write in this kind of voice a lot. If you've read some of my work, if you've read Bad Art, which is my short story collection, the story Bad Art is heavily inspired by Mickey Spillane, as are several other stories. Quite a few of my short stories are influenced by the noir genre in general, and Spillane in particular, and he is so readable no matter what your favorite genre is. I think you'll enjoy Spillane. Check him out. In terms of enjoyment, I've rarely found a more enjoyable author than Douglas Adams. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the 5-book trilogy, yes, I said that correctly. The books get kind of continually worse as they go along. The last couple books of the trilogy probably show that it should have stayed an actual trilogy. But the first 3 are all very good, and the first one is a masterpiece. It is hilarious and satirical. It undermines pretty much all of 20th century culture. Not American culture, because Douglas Adams is British, but culture in general. He is lambasting politics. He's lambasting art. Nothing is sacred. He goes against religion and science. Like he throws everything under the bus in such a hilarious fashion. If you've only seen the movie from 2005, that's okay. It's well casted, but it does not give you the full flavor of the book. You need to read the book from the very first page. Far out in the uncharted backwaters, or the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy, lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles, it is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. I feel attacked. It starts with the end of the world blowing up, and then it goes from there. It's his voice and that sardonic wit that has so influenced me. Again, if you've read my writing, you'll taste Douglas Adams coming through. It's impossible to avoid him and Terry Pratchett and numerous others who kind of write in a similar humorous vein while still tackling serious subjects have, well, driven me to write in a humorous vein while tackling serious subjects. Read them. Now we move on to the most serious stuff. The authors that I would say, other than Twain, who I mentioned earlier on, the authors who have influenced me the longest, who I've been reading since grade school and have been learning from, and I started out by copying their styles directly, and eventually kind of transmuted all the combinations of my influences into my own voice. But all art begins with imitation, and you should really start imitating with the best. And it's hard to deny that one of the best of the 20th century is Ray Bradbury. And honestly, I didn't read this book until much, much later in life. This is Something Wicked This Way Comes. But I read Fahrenheit 451 on my own, not in school, years earlier. And I've also taught Fahrenheit 451 numerous times. That's not my favorite of his books. Actually, this one is my favorite of his novels. But my favorite work of Bradbury's, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, is his short stories. He is the ultimate master of the short story form. A lot of people think of him as a sci-fi author because they think of the Martian Chronicles or Fahrenheit 451. This itself is not sci-fi. This is more contemporary fantasy. And he's written a number of other contemporary fantasies, but he's also written a lot of just straight literary realist fiction. And it's a masterpiece. Not just the way he tells a story, which is wonderful. The characters that he builds are so relatable, but the way he uses language to describe things, to build a picture, to create a world. When he talks about Greentown, Illinois comes alive. I learned a lot about creating setting and place and atmosphere from Ray Bradbury. Pick up a Ray Bradbury short story. I recommend The Veldt. That's one of the earliest stories I read from him. I read that back in grade school, which is a short exploration of what might happen when parents let technology raise their children. And it's horrifying and amazing. Another one is A Sound of Thunder, about a man who goes back in time to shoot a dinosaur. And if you've heard of the butterfly effect, that's kind of where we get the idea of the butterfly effect from. Maybe not the originator of it, but he certainly popularized the idea. Ray Bradbury delves into ideas with such depth and such literary understanding, and he incorporates his own influences, including Edgar Allan Poe and Herman Melville and pretty much everyone who came before. Even Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote Tarzan, is an influence on Bradbury, as well as an influence on Heinlein, as well as an influence on me, even though he's a lot racist, but still a very good storyteller. Bradbury is not. Bradbury is very, very much liberal-minded, so you don't have to worry about being offended by him, but you do have to worry about being challenged by him, because he is going to make you think, and it's awesome. He's going to make you feel, so read Bradbury. Another one who really helped me with atmosphere, mood, and tone, and just my writer's voice overall, and I've loved him since I first read The Telltale Heart, which I think I might have been 9 years old. Edgar Allan Poe. This is followed The House of Usher and Other Tales. He is, when I say Bradbury is the great short story writer of the 20th century, Poe is the greatest short story writer of all time. And I'll fight you for that. Because there's just nobody else who can create an atmosphere like Poe. There's nobody else who can use his words in such a way that inspires such dread and such other emotional impacts as Poe does. So, in terms of style, I mean, Poe is probably second only to Twain as an influence on the way I write. And last, but certainly not least, his style I tried to imitate when I was very early on in my writing career, like 11 years old. I realized that I could not imitate his style because no one really can, because I'm not an English Don from the mid-20th century with PhD in linguistics and deep study of Norse and Celtic languages going back centuries, and I don't have the knowledge to create my own mythology with all the languages that go into creating my own mythology, to re-mythologize an entire section of the world. I'm not that brilliant. I will never be able to quite match J.R.R. Tolkien's work. But he has given me an inspiration, stars to shoot for. I have been basically trying to create my own Lord of the Rings ever since, and I may never get there. I will never write anything that I believe is quite of that quality, but that doesn't depress me anymore. Now that motivates me. It drives me. When you see how deep and how powerful and how true fantasy storytelling can be through Tolkien, you'll never forget it. If you've seen the movies, read the Lord of the Rings books. This is a Silmarillion. This is very different from the Lord of the Rings books. This is written more as a mythology. This influenced me very heavily in terms of world building, but it didn't influence me as much in terms of writing and storytelling, but the Lord of the Rings did. It's the book, I would say, Lord of the Rings, the 3 books in general, that made me want to be a writer more than any other series of books. So those are my top 11 most influential writers that I could come up with at the time, and I do recommend you guys try at least a little bit of all of them. As you can see, my tastes are pretty eclectic. I go all over the place. I don't read a lot of westerns or romance. Those are some genres I just don't really have much interest in, but otherwise, sci-fi, fantasy, literary fiction, I go all over the place. It's not any detective fiction, just any kind of pulp fiction. I'm really a big fan of pulp. I love it all. I love any kind of good writing, even if it's not considered the literary kind of good writing. All of it feeds my mind. All of it feeds into my own writing process, into what I'm going to create next. So I've got a million influences out there, but these are the ones I return to the most again and again and again. And I recommend you guys look and think about, what are you most inspired by? What are your biggest influences in writing? What can you go back to and get inspired by and start imitating in order to help create your own voice? That's pretty much all I had right now. So I again, thank you guys again. Repeating myself, I am tired. Thank you again for watching this episode and for tuning in, and for 100 subscribers. I really appreciate every single click that you give me. Subscribe to the channel if you have not yet. Please build that number up. I cannot wait for 1,000. I'll celebrate every milestone I hit on the way. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this, and go out there, do some reading, get inspired, and write. Peace.